All right. With that, I'd like to have start off with our invocation from Don Matanik, the Technical Specialist with Intertribal Timber Council. Don?
Tatskalap, good afternoon. Katyayel, thank you. And Nez Perce language, my grandmother's language. Today, I'd like to give thanks to everyone that has prepared this meeting, presentations, and thank you for all attendees that are here for good thoughts, good discussions, and think about ideas to help our tribal community. So Katyayel, thank you.
Thank you, Don. And I'll turn it over to Cody Decitel, the President of Intertribal Timber Council. Cody.
Thank you, Stephanie. Just want to welcome everybody this afternoon and potentially later for those that will see the recording. Excited to have this conversation. This is work that's been in progress for probably at least a decade and maybe more, recognizing all of the threats that we have across the nation, but particularly in the West associated with wildland fire, other disturbance, and climate change. So look forward to this engagement and where the conversation leads us.
Thank you, Cody. And we also have a welcome from Reid Robinson, Director of USDA Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations.
Hey, Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank ITC for hosting this call. My name is Reid Robinson. I'm the Director of Tribal Relations for the Forest Service. And you know, this strategy that the Forest Service is co-developing with Indian country, when I first heard about it, I was thinking, wow, this is a big deal. And I contacted Brian Farabee, who's here with us today leading this effort. And I said, you know, this is something that is going to have a significant impact on Indian country. And it falls within our trust responsibilities to engage with Indian country as soon as possible. And Brian wholeheartedly agreed. And so here we are, you know, meeting our intention about bringing information to Indian country. Although this is not consultation, this is information sharing. We'll have the consultation later. But we want to use this time to solicit input from across Indian country on how this plan shapes up. And it's really timely because, you know, during the White House Tribal Nations Summit a couple of weeks ago, we saw the issuance of the White House Office of Technology and Science issue a memo on ITEK and also the Joint Secretarial Order on co-stewarding federal land. And both of those items do mention and pertain to wildland fire. So we have 100% overlap, I believe, with Indian country and making sure this project and this initiative gets off in a good way. And thank you for your attention, and I look forward to collaborating with all of you in the future. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. I magically muted myself. So thank you, Cody, Don, and Reid. I would like to remind everyone to please introduce yourselves on chat. If you could share your name, your title, and the tribe, agency, or organization you're calling from in the chat, we'd appreciate that. I'm Stephanie Lucero. I'm going to be facilitating today. I'm with the National Center, and I gave a sample of introducing myself in the chat box. And I would remind folks that if they have any questions throughout today, please feel free to send those in the chat. We will be monitoring those. You can send them directly to myself or to everyone. And you can also raise your hand and we can identify anyone who wants to share a comment either through chat or otherwise. With that, I do want to get underway. I think some of our Forest Service and ITC team will be sharing who they are in the chat as another example. But I do want to get underway with our presentation, which is a background and overview of the Forest Service 10-year strategy. And so I'm going to turn it over to Brian Farabee, Chief Executive of Intergovernmental Relationships for the Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure Team. And so with that, I believe we'll be pulling up that slide shortly, and I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Cody. Thank you, ITC, and for the opportunity to visit with you today. And thanks, Reid, for that introduction. And am I coming through okay?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great, great. Laurel, if you would be so kind as to share the PowerPoint, I'd appreciate it. And what I would say to start off is this PowerPoint is a reflection really of some initial thinking, but I think it's also important to acknowledge, as Cody mentioned, we didn't just miraculously end here with the bipartisan infrastructure deal. There's been a lot of engagements over the years that has led us to this opportunity, and that's what I would like, maybe really an opportunity for the collective us. And I'll show you a little bit about over the last couple of decades of some key discussions and decisions that has led us to where we are today. So as I mentioned previously, I'm the team lead for the wildfire risk reduction team. The what we like to refer to it as the BID, the bipartisan infrastructure deal, really has more in it than just work around fuel reductions. And so we've divided that work up, if you will. My team is really focused on how do we help the agency, along with our partners, really show up in a different way to change the trajectory of what we're seeing in terms of wildfire risk and exposure to communities and critical infrastructure. And that really is a major part of the bill. I think there's approximately $5.5 billion in the bill that is identified for the agency. And of that, a little bit more than $3 billion is associated with fuel work. But in addition to that, there's other components in the bill as well. And I'll just share a little bit with you because I think you'll have interest in those as well. And then I'll also share with you kind of the key contact, which I think you probably know, but nonetheless, we just want to make sure I cover all aspects of the bill. So the largest part is around fuel reduction, but there are some additional parts. And so, Laurel, if you would go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the wildfire risk reduction team has a focus on hazardous fuels, but Chris French, the deputy chief for the National Forest System lands that many of you may have interacted with before, has components of the bill that deal with recreation, that deal with restoration, and that's both just restoration in terms of creating and maintaining resilient landscapes that I know you're very interested in, as well as post-fire restoration work. There are components for both of those in the bill, and he's overseeing that, along with mine reclamation, and then roads and trails and bridges work that's identified and funded in the bill. On the state and private forestry side, Jayla Rivera, the deputy chief there, she is handling all the work that is associated with grants and agreements, and there are definitely line items that have identified opportunities for tribes as well as states. It also deals with an issue we've been dealing with for a long time as an agency around firefighter pay. And of course, the development and revising of community wildfire protection plans. And so us three, I would say, are kind of sharing this leadership space, if you will, to ensure that we deliver on the infrastructure bill. And a lot of really close coordination and conversations taking place. And as I get into more of the presentation, research and development is really going to be the underpinning, if you will, for a lot of this work. We really are, between utilizing science and having conversations with tribes and states and NGOs, we really are going to let that help define and guide where we go and the kind of work that we do over the course of what we're calling a 10-year period, is what our team is looking to develop, a 10-year strategy that helps us get to the scale of the issues we're trying to deal when it comes to fuel reduction. And you know, the bid itself only has 5-year money, so we would be looking at utilizing that money for the period of time we have it, and then we'd be looking at using our normal allocation. And if we are so fortunate enough that the Build Better Back bill passes, then we would be looking at that funding source as well to help us further fund that 10-year work beyond the 5 years of the bid. Next slide, Laurel, please. So as I indicated, and as Cody mentioned, there's been a lot of people at this work for literally 2 decades. And so we go back to 2000 where we acknowledged and looked at the need for a national fire plan because of what we were seeing with respect to fire suppression needs, but just wildfire activity. And really from there, if you just move down our timeline, if you will, we really looked nationally to start developing wildfire risk assessments and working closely with key partners and stakeholders, tribes and states. And then we stood up a program that, we received additional authority that came in 2003 when we saw really a new tool called the Healthy Forest Restoration Act that we were able to use. And that allowed us to show up a little bit different in this work and across the landscape than we had in the past. We moved on in 2010 and we were afforded a new program. And, it was what we call the CFLR, or Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, that really helped us to, for the first time, I would say truly in a long time, in a very consistent and methodical way, show up as an agency when it comes to cross-boundary work, working with a number of key partners, stakeholders, if you will, interested members of the public, tribes, to really get at what we thought was the collective interest of all of ours as best we could in these landscapes, and really try to get at scale around a number of issues, not just fuel reduction. Next slide, Laurel. And then if you progress on, and we in 2012, we were really hot and heavy. We were talking about increasing the pace and scale of restoration. We had identified at that time approximately 80 million acres needing some level of treatment. And how are we going to embrace that and address that with our partners and other key landowners and key land stewards, right? Moved on, if you will, and moved to the omnibus bill and really try to continue to identify this case for change, this idea of, a fire funding fix, and then needing to shift from suppression to really get really active in a much more aggressive way when it comes to using fire on the landscape and addressing this fuels issue that we have. In 2020, we had John Phibbs, who retired. That was the previous predecessor to Jalef Rivera, as far as the deputy chief of state and private forestry, who went to the Hill and testified that, by using science and looking at what we've seen in terms of fire behavior, we can actually have some sense of where the greatest exposure exists on the landscape, and therefore might be those places that we put some more focus into, as opposed to some other areas, in order to really address this exposure from wildfires to communities, to critical water infrastructure, and to critical watersheds, amongst other things. And it was that testimony, along with really a long tenured commitment to this work that I've just shared, as well as a lot of partners and stakeholders speaking to representatives and Hill members to help us now see what we're seeing in terms of the bid and funding. So that was just to give you a little bit of idea of the journey that we've traveled from really 2000 as we see it to now, in terms of where we sit with this particular funding opportunity for the bid. With that, why don't I move into a little bit about how we're looking at approaching this 10-year, if you will, program of work or implementation plan, and from the standpoint of really hoping that you can help us give a sense to us of what you're thinking and what you hear when we talk about it, and how you see tribes playing a major role, and quite honestly, if you just think we missed some things as we think through this work. Next slide, Laurel, please. So like like our experience, like with any other legislation that passes, we understand as an agency, there is an expectation for us to show that we're ready to receive those funds and that we're ready to put them to use in a very expeditious manner. And so to that point, we've looked at this work in kind of a two-phase approach, if you will. So we've looked at the first years 1 and 2, and then we've looked at this work in years 3 through 10, and I'm gonna kind of speak to it in that light. And so in years 1 and 2, we felt there's a really important and critical need to be having conversations and starting to hold internal and external engagements, and which would include, formal consultation when we get to that point. We have not actually started our, what I would call hosting true internal and external engagements. We have been more than willing to have conversations with externals and well as employees as those times and opportunities have presented themselves. But that's a little bit different than what we're really thinking about when we talk about, full engagement. In addition to having these conversations in the first years 1 and 2, to both inform years 1 and 2, but also really to help inform years 3 through 10 in terms of how we show up around the work and where we do the work is going to be critically important. And we're really looking to, I would say, kick off those engagements in January. In the meantime, we've looked at work that has been done by a number of entities over the years through either our CFLR program, that Collaborative Forest Restoration program that I pointed to earlier, our Joint Chiefs program that we also have, or our Focus Landscape program. There's a number of those projects that have been done in a very collaborative frame that really do meet the intent of the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and they actually fall in landscapes that are critically important from a fire shed perspective. And so we thought taking a look at those in terms of possible early funding opportunities made sense to us. But what we looked at them against is, are they based in science? Are they strategic in nature? In other words, are they in the places that we believe they need to be in? We are very interested in your input and perspective on how do we ensure that we, in addition to this kind of science-based approach, how do we make sure that we're getting to the degree we can, this indigenous traditional ecological knowledge that we know tribes have and that we could benefit from. We're also looking at those projects with an eye towards, they have to be developed in a collaborative frame and they have to be cross-boundary. Regions and forests have to have the ability, i.e. capacity, to deliver on this work, or have the capacity to deliver on a significant portion of this work, while we at the Washington office level help facilitate and try to figure out how maybe to get them a little bit more additional capacity to get the work done in its entirety. And then lastly, another criteria, if you will, that we've been looking at maybe these early projects against is, not only are they science-based, are they in the right place, and are they done in a collaborative frame, but do they really get at reducing or mitigating exposure to critical infrastructure? All of those things are critically important. The bipartisan infrastructure deal actually speaks to many aspects of this, and we think that's the kind of the territory that we really need to be in, if you will, when it comes to these initial projects, as well as projects we think about in years 3 through 10. So hosting engagement sessions, identifying some of what we're going to call early successes in terms of potential areas to invest in, is work we have been doing and will be doing. And another piece of work we've been doing in these, few months that we've been together is what we're calling capacity solutions. We know there are places where we don't have the capacity we need now, even to really deliver what I would call our foundational or our basic stewardship work. And so we are going out to regions and we're asking them in forests and districts, and we're asking them for feedback. And we've approached this kind of in a phase process as well. So we know our chief has been clear about us getting a lot of this work done through partners and others, as opposed to us hiring a lot of employees internally to do this work, when in fact, this money is short-term in nature when we're talking about 5 years. And so we know we'll add some capacity, but we won't add the amount of capacity internally that we'll need to deliver this work. And so to that end, we know we'll need employees to really help us with grants and agreements. We know we will need additional employees to help us with contracting, and we know we'll need additional employees to help us with hiring, because we know that there will be requests from the field for additional employees. And so we've already moved out in filling some of those, what we call support staff positions, so that when the bill passed, we would be in a position to really receive the incoming requests from the field and be able to be more responsive than maybe we have in the past. And along those same lines, we've been looking at systems as well, not just hiring people, but we can no longer take 6 to 8 months to bring somebody on board. We really have to be a little bit more expeditious in our hiring process if we want to be successful at getting this work done in the timeframes we have. So the phased approach when it comes to hiring was, one, moving out of those support positions, and then two, we've established a sub-team, and I'll speak to them in a little bit more depth in a minute, that is really going to start to probe and ask questions of forest districts and regions about what they think their needs are. And it's kind of a three-pronged question. It's like, what do you think your needs are for just basic stewardship work, if you will? And then what do you think you'll need in order to really deliver on this work in the bipartisan infrastructure bill? And then what will you need if, in fact, the Build Back Better bill passes? Those can lead us to three different answers. And so, but we want to get a sense from the field what they might need. We want to roll that up, validate that, and then have this corporate strategic hiring plan, if you will, that allows us to maybe batch positions and hire in a much more corporate approach and much more faster timeframes. So that's a little bit of the data we're just trying to collect now from the field of what they think they need. And then we'll build a strategy in coming days around how best to meet those needs. Right now, I would say as an agency, we are doing some great work in some places when it comes to planning at the scale commensurate with the issues we're trying to address. But I wouldn't suggest to you that we're doing that consistently across the board. There's just a lot of work there. And so one of the things we feel like we're going to have in place in order to get to a kind of a scale we're talking about, which is we're talking about, 2 to 4 times the amount of fuel work, doing the amount of fuel work than we do now. And so now we do about 3 million a year, and we're talking about ramping up to somewhere around 5 million acres a year, to give you kind of an example. But in order to get to that level, we think we need to be able to plan faster, and we're going to have to do it at a much different scale than what we currently do it at. And so we have another sub team that's looking at planning and design to help us build a programmatic planning frame that can take in considerations different geographical locations, but help us get to the scale of planning and the level of analysis we need to really address this wildfire issue we're trying to address. And on the heels of that, as you well know, of course, we consult with tribes, but we also consult with NOAA. We also consult with Fish and Wildlife Service. We also engage and consult with our heritage friends at the state level. And so it's a conversation that we feel we need to have. If we change our frame around how we plan, what does that look like when it comes to consultation? Does it look exactly like we do it today? Or does it look like something different? And we just need insight and feedback and a perspective on that. As I mentioned, in these first couple of years, we're standing up sub-teams to help inform some of the work that we see coming in future years. And here again, I'll address the sub-teams in just a little bit. And then, of course, in the first years, we're going to have to initiate some additional planning if we're really going to ramp up and get at scale. that's going to be imperative that we start that here sooner than later. And as a part of this process, we've gone into this acknowledging that while some of this work we think is clear because of the work we've been doing with partners and tribes, if you will, all along the way, some of it may not be. And so we think that, we're going to have to plan, we'll have to implement, we'll have to analyze and or monitor, and then we'll have to adjust. Where we start year 1 may not look anything like year 10. That's just because of the evolution of our understanding, our knowledge, and our tools. And so I think that's the mindset that we go into this work with. Laurel, the next slide, please. So years 24 really start years are kind of 3 through 10 in this 10-year frame, if you will. So in years 24 through 26, we really would see ourselves ramping up. We would still be hiring to build capacity. We would really have moved out on planning to make sure we have that kind of work in the hopper, so we'll be ready to implement, while implementing still work from those projects we select in the first 2 years. We would be making adjustments as we see fit based on what we learn from those projects in the first couple of years. We'd be, through our engagement process with partners, we would hope that out of those conversations and those engagements, we would be identifying either rules, regulations, or policy that we might need some shifts or changes in. And with the possibility of really pursuing those in the Farm Bill that's about approximately 2 years out. That's really our next best mechanism to make any type of, regulation or policy changes by and large. And then years, the waning years and 27 through 31, we would hope we'd hit our stride, if you will. We would have ramped up and we would kind of have leveled out, and we would be working more at what we'd call our new norm, if you would. But we would still be learning and adapting from what we see from an implementation perspective when it comes to projects. So that's how we kind of see the phases, if you will, over this 10-year stretch. Years 1 and 2, early successes, really looking at that work that aligns with the bill that we've already done a lot of work with partners. Years 24 through 26, really those being our ramped up years, that would still be a combination of being informed by our engagement processes, but also here again, probably fed by work we've been working with partners and tribes on up to this point as well. And then 27 to 31, hopefully have kind of leveled out, and we're at that 5 million a year for sure by then, and hit our stride and really addressing these needs at the scale that I think collectively many of us see a need. Laurel, next slide, please. And so what does after the 10 years look like? Well, ideally we would have treated up to the 20 million acres and or addressed the most significant exposure on the landscape that we believe exists. And we would have done that in this kind of cross-boundary approach, working with tribes, NGOs, and states. We would also at that same time be working cross-boundary with our partners on non-Forest Service or non-NFS lands to also treat those additional acres that have been identified, which there has been identified to focus on up to 20 million on the National Forest System lands and up to 30 million on other federal, tribal, state, and private lands, for a total of somewhere close to 50 million acres we believe need some level of treatment over this 10-year period. So working both within the NFS land base, if you will, but also across boundary and assisting and supporting that work off of National Forest System lands, well, we believe is all of what it would take for us to feel like, we've seen the success we would like to see. In addition to that, we would have systems in place, like I mentioned before, like hiring or contracting or like grants and agreement. We would have those systems working in a way that both our partners and states and tribes, as well as our own employees, feel like they're meeting our needs. as opposed to some of the challenges we hear about now that people have navigating those systems. You know, we will have developed a process, if you will, on how we really look at projects to have them at scale with science as the underpinning, which is not necessarily how we go about our work now. And so really see that as a important step when we think about getting to a new norm. And through all of this, while the agency is excited and very pleased to have received this funding in the bid, and you know, remain excited about the possibilities of the Build Back Better bill, you know, we would like to see that our partners, tribes, states, as well as our congressional members perceive the Forest Service as a good investment. And we would just see that in our regular appropriations through a bump up of that, more so than hoping to see these influx of funds on occasion. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned previously, these are some of the things that we are using or using to frame our thinking when it comes to determining priority landscapes. You know, we've identified 1,800 fire sheds based on the fire trajectory and history in those landscapes, and have kind of ranked them in terms of the level of exposure that exists within them. We've identified, and we would look at using critical watersheds and community readiness, if you will, in terms of, do we have the social acceptance to get at scale? Are communities ready? Are they wanting to work side by side and get to a different trajectory around this work? And then, of course, folks would have to have used a scenario planning model that our scientists have really come up with to help us really address exposure to infrastructure, as well as other critical values, if you will. And as the last bullet points to, you know, in our engagement, we surely expect to hear from externals that while they will be interested in communities and community protected against wildfire risk and exposure and critical watersheds and critical water infrastructure, we believe there's going to be other values that externals are going to be interested in, and we want to hear those, and we want to have conversation around, you know, where and when do, you know, members of the public believe, and tribes and states believe that those values should come into play. Next slide. The purpose of this slide is really just to show you what I mentioned before. There's 1,800 fire sheds across the landscape. So all these colors represent a fire shed, and these fire sheds are approximately 250,000 acres in size. But I think what's critical with this slide is, this slide shows, if we were to treat the reds, the orange, and the yellows, which is really that top 10% of the fire sheds, if we were able to treat the top 10% of the fire sheds, we would be able to address up to almost 85% of the exposure that exists when it comes to communities and critical watersheds. And that's huge. Next slide. And that doesn't mean that the other colors that you see, like the blues, aren't important. It just means in those reds and yellows, and I believe greens, that's where we have much more significant exposure when it comes to infrastructure. But there are definitely other values, and other values that many are interested in, that show up in those blue colored fire sheds, if you will. And this map, what it just depicts is what the scientists have put together in terms of, if you wanted to use these in a way to build a 10-year plan, you could look at it in something like this. And so what this depicts is, year one, we wouldn't necessarily do any treatments because we would be building coalitions and relationships and partnerships, as well as hiring to build capacity. And then years 2 through 4, we'd really be getting into implementation as well as some planning, moving into years 5 through 7 and 8 through 10, and how you would go about it from that perspective. And as I mentioned before, that 85% exposure, being able to be treated in that top 10%, that if we were to map it alongside this map, we would probably fall in somewhere years 5 through 7 to hit that 85% projectile, if you will, is what we're estimating at this point in time. But that's really kind of what I wanted to show you, a little bit about the science that's been developed up to this point, a little bit of the team's thinking since we've been together since late September, early October. Acknowledge we've been more than willing to have conversations as employees have reached out to us, NGOs have reached out to us, states have reached out to us, and I've had the opportunity to visit with WFLIC a couple different times where I know tribes also have representation. And so I'm excited about being with you here as well today and engaging you in just what I would call some thinking to this point about how we might consider going about the work. So with that, I turn it back over to you, Stephanie, for any questions or comments that folks may have.
Great, thank you, Brian. I will encourage our participants, and particularly our tribal participants on the phone, if you want to raise your hand to open up the mic for any questions or discussion. While you're doing that, I know Cody had some points, some summary of some previous Intertribal Timber Council discussions on the 10-year plan. So I'm going to turn it to Cody while folks get prepped with their questions. Cody?
Stephanie, and thank you, Brian. Excellent summary, and appreciate all the hard work the forest has done to set us on a trajectory to be successful as this funding that Congress has allocated for us. For those of you that have worked with the ITC in the past, you know that this has been an issue that we've discussed with the forest for a long time, like I said, a decade or more. Funding was typically the limitation in the past, and staffing capacity, which was usually tied to funding limitations. But now this is that kind of once in a career opportunity for really a very unlimited amount of funding, really is probably the way I should term it, to go out and do work. And Congress has answered the call. They've given us what we've asked for. Now it's our job to go out and take advantage of that opportunity and that funding and show them what the benefits are of accomplishing this work. So in these conversations in the past between the ITC and the forest, we were focused on resilience in the landscape, protecting communities, protecting tribal values and tribal retained rights in their ceded territories. There was so much benefit out there that we really recognized the potential, the wins that could be made by engaging in this and working together, not just with our federal partners, but with our state and NGO partners as well. So through those conversations, I think there's been a lot of talks back in Congress, pushing certain agendas to try to get us to this point in time. And now that we have this opportunity, again, we're looking for feedback on how we implement this, because we recognize with this amount of funding, that capacity doesn't exist in the system now, not in any of the federal agencies, state agencies, or with the tribes. So it will take a concerted effort by all of us, pulling on the rope the same direction, coming to, I guess, some agreement, some strategy, some path forward on what those priorities are, how we accomplish those in the time frame we've been given, and how we add capacity. And again, hopefully, if we're successful in doing so, it will show Congress that those investments were well founded, that in that 10-year period, we will demonstrate what we've told them for the last decade, that if you invest more money in fuels and restoration work, that you will see decreased spending on fire suppression. And hopefully that will be the case. That may take some more policy issues and some discussion about how we manage wildfire on the landscape, recognizing that particularly in the West, those are fire adapted ecosystems, but really more focus on post-fire outcomes. Again, recognizing that those are fire adapted ecosystems and fire will take place, but under what conditions and to what extent do we influence post-fire conditions, and really that threat to public infrastructure and the communities. We know we've not been very successful at that in particularly certain parts of the country over the last 5 or 6 years, but we also recognize that there's solutions to that. It just takes a lot of work, a lot of coordination between different land management agencies, and really a lot of outreach to the public so that they understand why this is important. And we get that social license to go out and do this work with their support and hopefully with their feedback. So they explain to us what they see as priorities, and then we can carry out that work to further that conversation, to allow us to expand that current workload, to really get past that threshold, to start to push that needle back the other way. That's a battle we've lost for a long time because of our success in suppression. And for those of you that have heard me talk, I struggle with our approach in the past where we come at this from purely a suppression standpoint, because we're really effective at initial attack. We catch almost every fire that starts, but the few percent we lose burn about 90% of the acres, and they burn them under the absolute worst burning conditions. So, I mean, we have severities that were very uncharacteristic compared to historic conditions. So again, we've got the opportunity now to work together to change that dynamic, to change that outcome in the future, particularly recognizing what we expect to see in climate change. The projections now are not good. So unless we take action in the very near future, what we have for the future probably isn't something that any of us will like very much. To get to the priority list, so when we look at the 10-year strategy, years 1 and 2, I think that's a great approach. Try to build capacity, try to take advantage of that low-hanging fruit, try to take advantage of those places where we've got good working relationships and cross-boundary collaboration, and create that blueprint for the places that doesn't exist. And then let science inform what the next 7 years of that implementation looks like. Because we know there's so many priorities on the landscape. It's that whole eating the elephant analogy. Where do we start with that many acres in need of treatment? And really, it's got to be prioritized around communities, because that's our highest risk. That's always been our highest priority when we look at suppression resource allocation. So again, look forward to people's feedback. We know there's a lot of diversity across this country as far as what infrastructure looks like, where people are, what fuel types there are, what fire behavior is. And there's no small group of people that can answer all of those questions. So I think by engaging in this and trying to pull in as many parties, as many interested folks as we can, we will get that diversity of perspectives and get the great ideas that the public has available for us. And I will conclude my comments with that.
Thank you, Cody. I am not seeing any hands raised, but if anyone wants to open up their mic or share any questions in the chat, I do encourage them to do so. And while we're seeing if anybody has any additional questions or comments on the overview or Cody's comments, Reid, did you have any additional points for consideration that you wanted to share? Oh, you know what? Wait, I'm going to hold off on that because we have a hand raised from Gary Morishima. Gary, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the presentations and the comments. Just a quick reaction from sort of a guy that's been around for a long time here is that I'm glad that we have this opportunity, but I'm a little bit concerned about the emphasis on what appears to be a pretty heavy bureaucratic process. A lot of planning, a lot of capacity building over an extended period of time. The need is really urgent, and the conditions are changing rapidly. I view this opportunity as being important, but we've got to recognize it has to be sustained over an extended period of time. So one of the things I'd like to have some discussion about is whether there's a way that we can reduce the emphasis on central systems and control. I think that there needs to be some way to free the field, if you will, to provide the means to enable local action to be taken. As Cody had indicated, the conditions are changing, and the conditions and circumstances are going to be quite different from place to place. So I think that we need to find a way of supporting local action to be able to act quickly to be able to be nimble, to be opportunistic, to take preventive action and actively manage the landscape and the forest, and not just focus on wildfire. We've got to deal with all of the aspects of the forest and make sure that we are caring for the land, the water, the trees, the wildlife, the fish, and all the other things that are also affected here. We have to be able to anticipate and respond to changing circumstances while maintaining accountability. So I'm really glad to see the cross-boundary approach and the recognition of the need to substantively involve tribes. I think tribes with their long history of stewardship of the land and use of fire as a tool and as a means to accomplish landscape scale objectives. I think that's really important to bring to the fore.
Thank you, Gary. Want to check and see, Brian, Reid, or any of our other Forest Service or ITC folks, do you have any thoughts on Gary's comments?
Well, this is Brian. So Gary, I would just say, I so appreciate your comments and your perspective. I think we too would want to reduce the amount of bureaucracy, although we're never going to have some. I think we want to reduce to the degree we can. That's why we're talking about a planning model that's like a third the time of what it usually takes right now. We need people to activate. You know, we're talking about how do we move some of this funding out to tribes, but also to other partners to actually accomplish this work, right? So we're not standing still while we're trying to build capacity, but we're doing some things simultaneously. And for us, absolutely about activating.
Brian, you froze a little bit.
Uh-oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you froze on activating.
Okay. So we absolutely want to activate our field folks. I think, but this control piece, I think, gets to your point about accountability. While we want people doing good work in the field with their partners and our partners, we also want to make sure we're in the right places and we have alignment. We know there's going to be tremendous oversight of this money, and at the end of all of it, collectively, we need to be able to tell a very comprehensive story about what we accomplished with these funds. And so from that perspective, that's a role that I think the Washington office will want to make sure we're able to play, because that we have not been in that position in some cases in the past, and that hasn't served us very well. So absolutely in agreement with your perspective and comments, and thanks for that.
And Stephanie, if I could, I would just add that when we look at defining what work gets done and what measurable objectives are and what we define as success, we need to be careful about that, because again, we've always taken a suppression approach to that, and we've always really tried to quantify success by lower burn acres, and that's probably not a reality, particularly when you look at the fire regimes in the West, that it should be more burn acres every year, but under different conditions with different post-fire outcomes. And I think by doing this work, particularly if it's planned accordingly through pods and fire sheds, that you can allow for some of that and still demonstrate that although burn acres may go up, suppression costs may go down, and really resource damage is decreased over the long term.
Reid, or any of our other team, or Gary, I'll open to you, Reid.
I really appreciate Gary and Cody's comments. You know, this is the kind of dialogue that I look forward to hearing. And, you know, I think we need to, you know, be establishing an ongoing formal dialogue in order to incorporate the ideas that are coming from Indian country, because we're not going to get these ideas from this perspective from anybody else. And where Indian country is located are in those rural areas and in urban areas, but in rural areas, an Indian country is a force multiplier. And so I'm interested in not only hearing the technical expertise coming from Indian country in the traditional perspective, but also, how can we ensure that we have proportional focus on Indian country values and assets? There are going to be, the interesting thing about working with Indian country, we have 574 individually sovereign entities, not 50 like states. But my experience working with state subject matter experts their perspectives are somewhat relatively confined to something that I'm really, really familiar with. But these individual tribes, the 574 of them, that's a lot more perspectives than 50. So I want to make sure that we are affording the opportunity to engage with Indian country, so our process and our strategy has integrity, and that includes funding. And this process is, as Brian mentioned, 5 years in the bid and 10 years overall for the strategy. That's half a generation of Indians. So there's Indians right now that are 10 years old that are going to be 20 years old when this strategy is theoretically done and another one comes around. We need to be focusing on that next generation that is going that can provide support for the ongoing implementation of the strategic plan. So I think we need to make an education investment in Indian country. I think we need to make a technical assistance investment. I think research and development has a significant role, and they're actually getting ready for that. So once again, I'm here talking when I should be listening, and I really want to listen more and more and more, and try to figure out ways that we can have more in these discussions where we're capturing the ideas from Indian country that we need to capture to inform the plan.
Thank you, Reid. Cody, go ahead.
So I see we've got a number of forestry staff from individual tribes on the phone. I'd like to get their perspectives on how they see implementation of this, because I do recognize that there's funding limitations in Indian country. We have very small staffs comparatively, and the funding we get from the BIA is directed specifically at the management of trust acres. So even to pull a proposal together to send in would take tribal funds that the tribal council may not be willing to part with when we look at all of the other tribal priorities that tribal governments have to deal with. So for those of you that are from Indian country, I'd love to get your perspectives.
All right, we have a call out for our tribal foresters on the phone.
Well, Alex Maney, the Fond du Lac forester or Fond du Lac forest manager. I think that the point that the guy made about investing in education, I think is a very good important point, because a lot of the labor that is available, at least with my experience, it tends to be local labor, and it's important to cultivate the skill set of your workforce so that they're able to do a lot of the fuels projects, they're able to operate saws, get fire qualifications. So
Okay. Thank you, Alex. Cody, you're tempting me to go through and check and see if we have anyone else.
I was going through the list myself. Don't want to put anybody on the spot, but we might have to call on people.
While you're looking through the list and folks are getting the courage to jump in, I will point out that this is intended to be kind of the start of this conversation. In addition to today's session, there will be a tribal roundtable in January for more in-depth discussions. And if you go to the ITC website, that topic discussion was some of the topics that are being proposed. But if you think there's other topics we need to talk about, if the themes that are outlined in there don't talk about what Alex and Reid just mentioned about capacity building and building tribal workforces, please feel free to add those in. We can add those into the discussion as well. So don't want to put you on the spot, but there's an opportunity today to also launch into our later discussions. So anybody, Lan, I see your hands up, and I'm going to see if we have any more tribal foresters that want to speak up.
Not seeing any hands. I will add that understanding that for many of you, this might be the first time you've seen this information. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us here at the ITC, and we will do our best to explain what engagement we've had before, what opportunities we see for tribes in Indian country, and then again, get your feedback and try to compile that into something comprehensive that we can share with the Forest Service.
So Lynn, I saw your hand up. You wanted to add anything?
I actually just want to ask a question to follow up on the previous one. Is when we talk about capacity building, what does that look like? What do you need from the Forest Service to do that? Is it just money? Do you need people? I'd like to know what that looks like so we can help make that happen.
Not seeing any others, I'll take a crack at it. I would say the answer is probably yes. That depending on the tribe, they will have different amounts of capacity, different needs, and different priorities, frankly, depending on where they're from and what they have access to. So I think that's really hopefully a conversation that tribes will engage with their local forests on. So if they've got priorities, if they've got projects they want to see done, they will open those lines of communication and have that conversation and see how they can take advantage of this to accomplish those tribal goals. And again, if people need help making those points of contact, we know lots of folks in the Forest Service that can get you pointed in the right direction here at ITC. So feel free to reach out, or I would encourage you, because I mean, this is something I did early when I took this position as Natural Resource Director. Go stop by and make a visit, develop a relationship with your Forest Service partners. There will be dividends paid, I guarantee it.
Gary, go ahead. I see your hands up.
Yes, I think that this issue of capacity is something we have to look at from the standpoint of all the partners. Certainly the tribes need some assistance in terms of not only financial assistance, but they need to have access to some scientific information. You know, it's difficult for tribes to even have access to available research, for example, or be able to contact or reach out to some of the academic expertise and industry expertise that may be out there. So trying to find some way of bringing together a process that enables us to put all of the information together that we need to really understand the issues and how we might be able to approach them. It would be helpful. I think it's also would be helpful to think about what we could do to improve the capacity within the service, the Forest Service, to work more closely with tribal communities. There's very limited ability and understanding of the nature of federal tribal relations and responsibilities of the Forest Service. How do you work with tribes? How do you approach tribes in terms of being respectful and being able to solicit and utilize and consider the information that's available from within those communities, from the knowledge holders and those sorts of things. There are processes and protocols that I think that there would be some benefit in having some sensitivity training or awareness training, that sort of thing with the Forest Service so that they can interact more closely with the tribal communities.
Thank you, Gary. Matt, I noticed your hands up.
Yeah, I'd just add, and sorry, I'm losing my voice. I'm nodding a lot, but I can only speak in short sentences. So just adding to Gary's point, one thing I've noticed is that, at the forest level, there's usually very close coordination with tribes, but it's more on cultural resources, archaeology, maybe biology, but the timber managers and the fire people aren't necessarily, depending on where you are, may not be talking. So there's usually close connections, but it's not all the way around through all the divisions of the forest. So I think getting the land management people, the timber management people, the fuels management people more engaged is probably where the focus should be. On the tribal capacity side, the one thing I would add is that, for smaller tribes, I think what they're facing is just a challenge finding anyone to even start these conversations and figure out what it is that they could do with their local forest. And those tools are out there. They're being refined and developed, through the TFPA and 638 contracting authority, which will help build that tribal capacity to work with the Forest Service on these types of projects and get acres treated. But I would note that we're still struggling because we don't have full good neighbor contracting authority, because we don't have the receipt retention, which is critical to build. That's how states have built their capacity to work with you on good neighbor projects. So tribes and counties still don't fully have that. And then on the cooperative landscape scale restoration program, while tribes were mentioned in the law, we still we're not technically defined properly to work with you on that. So I noticed that in the slide deck, and so we still have to get a legislative fix for that. So once those obstacles are cleared, I think that will help tribes develop an internal capacity that's dedicated to working with the Forest Service on these projects.
Thank you, Matt. And
Hey, Stephanie.
Alex, I heard a Stephanie, and I did
Just-
notice that Alex unmuted. Is that you, Brian?
Yeah, I just wanted to see if I tried to take notes, but if Matt could follow up, and if we could get that information from Matt on those recommendations on possible policy changes, that'd be really helpful.
And
Sorry,
Alex, I
Finney.
just want to, no worries, Brian. I just want to hold that space. You look like you unmuted. I just want to see if you wanted to add anything, Alex, from earlier.
Oh, no, I think that was just a misclick on my end.
All right. And I apologize if anybody's trying to unmute. I can't see all the unmutes, but if you raise your hand, that's the reactions button at the bottom. But if you want to try and unmute and just jump in, I know that's sometimes feels uncomfortable, but we'll do our best to track anyone unmuting. Don, go ahead, hands up.
Thanks. One thing I did is I put in the chat box, a recommendation would be to support and expand something like the Northwest Youth Corps Tribal Stewards Program. It started, the Forest Service and the BIA actually started putting seed money into this program. The program's located in Eugene, Oregon, but they are starting to expand out of Oregon into up into Washington. They have a program called in Tacoma, Sound to Summit. And I think there's some programs and some models already running locally, but they would be a good model to expand, maybe even nationwide, come from out of Oregon into Washington State, maybe California, and that would be a recommendation if you wanted to get some money allocated into a system that's already there and proven successful, and it just needs more support and expand, especially with 70% of our native populations in urban areas, especially places like Portland, San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle, Tacoma. That's why I'm excited when I saw Northwest Youth Corps expanding to Tacoma. But seeking programs that are successful already and just looking at those programs to expand a little bit more, because if it's successful, that's where the money's well spent, is supporting and expanding something that's already there. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. I want to be cognizant of time. Feel free, open up if you have additional. I did want to remind folks that, again, and Reid, jump in if I get any of this wrong. In addition to this session, which will be recorded, so if you want to share it with folks who weren't able to join us today, there is going to be a number of roundtables in January, both regional roundtables as well as another tribal roundtable, coordinated hopefully by ITC and others. And just posted in the chat box, it's also available on the ITC webpage, the proposed discussion topics, and capacity, workforce capacity is identified as a potential topic. But please take a look at that and see if there's additional discussion topics that you think will be important for that January tribal roundtable. And then considerations to either share today is whether or not these recommendations for these information sessions in the roundtables, or this is the best way for engaging tribes in discussions. Are there additional discussion topics that you'd like Forest Service to consider? Are the right questions being asked in the discussion topics? And we heard a little bit about this from Gary in terms of technical resources, but what other information or resources do tribes need between now and January for those discussions? So more specific to this starting plan piece, those are some questions for you all to consider. We have those in the chat box. And I'd also point out that in addition to the regional roundtables that will be locally based, as well as a tribal roundtable in January, there will be, Reid, I believe, commencement of government-to-government consultation, nation-to-nation consultation started in January on this plan as well. Anything to add there, Reid, in terms of next steps?
Yeah, well, so the Forest Service has a 120-day consultation period, so that's pretty decent compared to some of our sister agencies. So yeah, I don't believe we have that scheduled yet. We do have a pretty decent process that we've been using to conduct virtual consultation. I think it will work well for this. It's just a matter of getting the word out and making sure we have enough consultation scheduled on something that's significant. There's so many interconnected pieces to this work that are either new or available, like the authorities that we have that we're going to be expanding our use of. And then there's other initiatives like Don mentioned, Indian Youth Corps. So we've been having listening sessions with DOI and NOAA starting yesterday on draft Indian Youth Service Corps a guidebook, and I put the draft in the link, and it does, there's a fuels reduction, wildfire protection focus there. In addition to that, it's not just about having a bunch of youth on crews, which is amazing, and it was the core of the program, but it's also about internships and either in the professional or trades fields as well. So that's what I mean about interconnectivity. And so I think I look forward. I think we're coming to Indian country at the right time, which doesn't happen, I think, often enough. And so I appreciate, the team that Brian's working with. Brian doesn't have a huge team. He's going to have to rely on a group of many subcommittees, and those of you in Indian country are part of that power wheel that Brian's going to need to implement, and his team for the Forest Service to implement. So, that's the way I look at this. Is Indian country is a significant part of that power wheel. I don't know if anybody else on my team that has anything relative to say. Go ahead and say it or put it in the chat, please.
In addition to capacity building, are there any other topics that we think need to be put front and center to these discussions on the plan?
It wasn't lost on me, the comment that was made about tribal liaisons. That is still a fact. That we do need to be putting forth individuals that work with Indian country that are either decision makers or people that are supporting the decision makers that are informed and are culturally competent, and we're working on that as well. I expect to see additional vacancies come out to fill forest level and regional level tribal relations positions. And I even see this is my thought. I think there needs to be a full-time somehow Indian country needs to be embedded in the Forest Service on fire, and I don't really know what that would look like other than having a lot of conversations, but I don't know if it's having a task force or a group of tribal leaders that serve as ambassadors for Indian country, but also perhaps an individual that is solely dedicated to the relationship between this initiative and Indian country. So like a fire type liaison for Indian countries. So that's something that I've been thinking about as well.
I'm cognizant of what Cody mentioned, that we did, for some of you, this might be the first time you saw the 10-year plan. So please sit with it, take a look. We will have another opportunity to discuss it in more detail in January, as well as for those of you that prefer to do nation-to-nation consultation, there will be some of that scheduled in the near future. The discussion topics proposed for January are in the chat box and on the Intertribal Timber Council website. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions for those topics, please send those along to Andrea Luke's. Her email is also in the chat as well in that discussion forum. And in the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, just want to open the floor to any additional comments, questions, thoughts, maybe focusing on the types of information or additional opportunities that from our tribal representatives or partners on the phone that you'd like to see between now and January.
Stephanie, I think it would be helpful if the Forest Service developed some type of informational that they could share with tribes, because this is a great opportunity and we're talking about it as ITC, but also in my regular job, I recognize that infrastructure bill was huge and there's tons of funding in there for Indian country. So it's going to be a challenge for tribes to try to respond to all of that available funding in all of those different functional areas along with this. So the more information we can share, the more likely I think they are to take advantage of it and partner with their neighboring land management agencies. And it may be, I mean, to Reid's point about liaisons, I mean, maybe that needs to be at the forest level, that we have people appointed at the forest that become that point of contact, that make that outreach to the respective tribes, to the state management agencies, to any other NGOs or large landowners that would potentially want to participate.
Nanaba, if you wanted to jump in, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I was trying to leave room for the tribal representatives, but just so for those of you who don't know me, I'm just like a ground level tribal liaison. I work in the Southwest, and I led a lot of tribal consultation for the Forest Restoration Initiative, which is one of the largest forest restoration initiatives in the country. And we have really done super extensive consultation. So I do know, one, tribes want this work done. And one of the things that I've heard them ask for over and over again is we could use assistance with capacity building. We have folks that want the work, but we don't have the right training. So if the Forest Service could provide that training, then we would be able to hire more folks. I've even heard offers of, well, you guys can come do the work for us and we'll just permit you to operate on our tribal reservation because we want our lands treated. So there's so much technical assistance that the tribes have brought up over and over again, and we haven't really figured out. I mean, we have tools, we have the TFPA, we have 638, and it allows us to kind of direct money, but if they don't have the net to catch it, or the right people who are like those super people, like the Superman people who have the initiative, you know, we have had those requests of, well, help us develop those people. And we do have success stories and we do have a lot of lessons learned. I really appreciated the comments from Don and from Gary. I'm just throwing that out there. There's definitely ways that we can be working better with tribes if we just figure out the right, you know, the right recipe there.
Thank you. Floor is open for our tribal reps on the phone. So, and recognizing that you might want to just sit with this information and come back in January. Laura did post, we will have a more focused invitation for the January session, but all you have to do is fill out that Google form that we just posted in the chat box and is also on the ITC website. And we will send you the information for the January sessions. They will likely occur towards the last couple of weeks of January. And we'll get you that information as we fine tune it. We're going to take some of the comments we heard from today, any comments that you send to Andrea in terms of discussion topics, and use that to put together those roundtable dialogues. So unless we have any other comments or questions from the group, I'll just turn it over to Reid for some closing remarks and reminders. Reid, go ahead.
You know, if I'm looking pensive, it's because I am. I didn't, I just want to say that, you know, it's an honor to be able to sit here and listen. And, you know, I look forward to listening more and more. This is an area I'm learning more and more about. You know, I used to, you know, be like one of those guys that went out on fires and, you know, I'd go because I needed the money, and then I'd be out there and I'd look around and I'd go, why am I out here doing this? In some cases it was really obvious, in some cases it wasn't. And I think our agency needs to have perspective about what fire means to Indian country in all ways. And how it impacts these communities. You know, where I do my ceremony is on land that's 2 million acres of land, trust land, that there's 60,000 people living on that land, and there isn't one Type 1 engine on that. You know, so these are communities that you know, we're talking about fighting wildfire in the richest country in the world. Yet, and we're the trustee, and we have an obligation to proportionately support Indian country. Proportionately. That doesn't mean equally. That means proportionately. And if there's tribes out there that have 2 million acres and they don't have a fire engine to put out a single building on their entire land, that's not good. We got a long ways to go. And I think this is the right time. This is the right time to begin heading in a good direction. And so I look forward to it. I really feel good about you know, this thing that we're building, and the fact that there's not a lot of comments and questions right now. I'm not surprised, because you know, the first time this was presented to me, I didn't know how to respond to it, and I still don't, and that's a good thing, because it's ambiguous and nebulous enough right now that the structure is being built, and we're here to ask Indian country to help us put the muscle and the tendons and the ligaments on the bones of this body that we're building. So I look forward to more conversations. So I just want to thank you for being here today. And I want to thank Brian and his team as well for recognizing the importance of this dialogue that we need to have with Indian country. So that's all I have to say. And I wish everybody a great day and a great rest of the week.
So Stephanie, before we go, I'd just like to echo Reid's comments. I mean, I've been with the ITC for a long time. This has not always been the case, that the Forest Service reaches out to us early to get tribal input and feedback on what these processes look like. And it's pretty clear that Brian's team's done a lot of work on this even before the legislation was passed, to be prepared for when it passed. So we appreciate that work done in advance. I think it puts us in a great spot to take advantage of this in the near term, and look forward to that dialogue going forward.
Thanks, Cody. Thank you, Reid. Well, with that, there's plenty of links to follow up. If you digest and have some more information or need more information, please feel free to contact ITC or Forest Service at the links we provided in the chat box. And until then, we will see most of you hopefully in January and hear from you until then. Thank you all. We'll give you another 4 minutes back to your day. If you'd like to stay on to get more details, feel free, but otherwise have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining us today.